Hey everyone, you are listening to the 6th episode in the ClassofHC 2016 Election Clapback podcast. It's a series that was inspired by a good book that I read this summer, and a series that's been provoked by a lot of the foolishness that we have all seen in this year's election campaign for president in the U.S. I am Day G, host and curator of the Class of Hope and Change documentary. You can find out more about that project at ClassofHC.com. Last time we talked about a period in history when America wasn't so great, the Great Depression of the 1930s. This time we're talking about a time when America got its greatness back. For those of you listening for the first time, thanks for checking out the podcast. This series was inspired by a really good book that I read this summer called Economix, spelled Economix. It's a book by Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. The link is in the description. I don't know the authors formally, and I'm not getting paid to plug it, but I was really inspired by the way they presented history. They told the history of America, focused on our economic history, and they told that history in comic book form, and I just thought it was really clever and really got me to thinking a lot about what's going on in our country right now, and I felt like I learned more from that book than I'd learned in a year of watching coverage of the current election season on television, and so I felt like some other people might benefit from that, and that's why the podcast exists. So this episode is arguably the most important one in the Election Clapback series because it's the period of time that is driving so much of this year's presidential election discussion. So we pick up at the point in the book that talks about life in America towards the end of World War II and moving into the 1950s and 60s. So in the 40s, during the American involvement in the war, many Americans were working jobs that were related to requiring to build equipment for the armed forces in order for the Americans to help win the war. So the federal government required workers to be paid well and also passed a law imposing price controls on any businesses that were selling goods so that there couldn't be inflation. Businesses couldn't charge more and more money. They had a limit on how much they can charge during wartime. So you had people getting paid well, you had costs of things being kept relatively stable intentionally by the government, so people actually had more money at the end of the month, so they kind of had nothing else to do but save money. Also, the government passed a program called the GI Bill. It helped pay for veterans to get a college education. It helped veterans financially to start businesses, helped them to buy homes. You also had unions that, as we've talked about in earlier episodes, for the prior 40, 50 years had been pushing and struggling and fighting and getting beaten and attacked. And we were at the point in the 40s and 50s where the 8-hour work days were standard for workers in a lot of other industries beyond car manufacturers. And in 1949, the federal government also passed minimum wage laws. These were passed to make sure that a business couldn't just pay someone whatever they wanted, but actually had to provide some sort of a wage that allowed people to live based on the work that they put in. So this is also around the time that payments were being made by the government to unmarried mothers who had children and no man working in the house. And so that also was another way of trying to help make sure that Americans were not without resources in times of need. So add to this, in the 1950s, President Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, created a government program to build highways that connect states and cities across the country, the interstate highway system. So any of you who have taken a good road trip, or if you've taken a trip basically anywhere in this country by highway, that entire network of highways that crisscross the entire nation is basically only 60, 65 years old. We just came up with that. So all those things I named were things the federal government did. We talked last episode about things the federal government did to step in. So one of the questions continues to be in this election clapback moment, when we are told what can't be done and that people disagree and there's gridlock and all these words people use to explain why policies and programs can't be implemented to help Americans. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the things that we think always existed are relatively recent in human history and all got passed in part from the federal government. So it's not like these things haven't happened before and can't happen again. So when we hear talk about making America great again, this is the time most people that you hear say this now are talking about, the 1950s in particular. So all those things I just talked about the government was doing to help out, all the money people had saved up and partially because the government made sure that most people who were working in businesses that were helping the war effort were paying people fair wages, so people had savings. So you take all those things together, and 1950s is where we end up. Government was big and seemed to be doing a lot to help put money and capital into the hands of working people. Businesses were also big and seemed to be willing to work with their workers and employees for conditions and wages that allowed today's older people to have childhoods that they remember so fondly. As we talked about in earlier episodes, and if you're listening to this particular episode for the first time, definitely go back and check out episode 2 and episode 3, where we talked about the rise of big businesses in America, where we talked about labor and the unions and how some of the situations, many of the situations that we take for granted, were really hard fought wins. Literally, people, gave their lives so that you could have something like an 8-hour workday, and there weren't child labor laws and all these protections that we have. So keep in mind that when you hear people talk about going back to a time when America was great, the people who talk about that were children when this happened. And all these other things I talked about were the conditions that allowed their childhoods to be remembered so well in their memory today. So the election clapback question, for me at least, is what is the government doing today for working people? And that's a very specific question. I think that we do ourselves a disservice as a country when we do not force people to answer that question. I just reeled off for now 20 years of policy. If we go back to last episode when we were talking about the 1930s, all this stuff the government was doing on behalf of working people. We talked about some of the Americans that were held out of some of those promises. We'll leave it at that. Check out earlier episodes if you want to get the full context of what I mean by that. But the government was doing all this stuff. So the question today for us is, what is the government doing for working people? Question 1. Question 2, election clapback question, is what are big businesses doing so that the children of their employees, today's children, could grow up feeling comfortable and have happy memories of their childhood the same way today's older Americans remember their childhood, right? So much of this Make America Great Again is people remembering their childhood. They weren't adults then. So we all kind of have a way that we remember our childhood. And if you remember your childhood positively, there are probably some adults who were doing something right that allowed some good memories to happen to you. And so the question is, what are we doing so that the children growing up right now will have fond memories of being comfortable and happy and feeling like things were wonderful? And as I've done with the past few episodes, part of the work of this Election Clapback series, in my opinion anyway, is to offer yet another space for people of goodwill and good sense, sorry, haters and trolls, to think about America's history and America's present. And so, as I did in episode 4, I present a few quotes from people, from Americans, who were present at the time when America was great again, this time of the 1950s, early 60s, this time when so many people in America right now look back to and remember as a time when their childhoods were happy and things were simpler and the world made sense. So important in this understanding of how this country got to where it is today that we include some more opinions, as many eyewitnesses as possible who can help us to understand exactly what was happening during this time when people told us America was great. As I've done in earlier episodes, I present these quotes without commentary. I will provide the name of the person given the quote, so feel free to start your research and visit a library or a college campus, or at the very least, Google. And you can find out more about the people who gave these quotes and what they were doing and why they said those quotes, and we can begin another conversation. Again, we definitely love to hear what you're thinking and get a sense of what the ideas are where you live. Reach out to us on social media. We're at ClassofHC on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. You can also email us at ClassofHC@gmail.com. Please use the hashtag Election Clapback when you are reaching out to us so that we can see your posts and definitely, hopefully, try to create a conversation amongst people of goodwill and good sense. Quotes from eyewitnesses during the time when America was great. Again. Number 1, quote, "My activism did not spring from my being gay, or for that matter, from my being black. Rather, it is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values that were instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. Those values are based on the concept of a single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal. End quote. Bayard Rustin. Number 2, quote, our opponents in the agricultural industry are very powerful, and farm workers are still weak in money and influence. But we have another kind of power that comes from the justice of our cause. So long as we are willing to sacrifice for that cause, so long as we persist in nonviolence and work to spread the message of our struggle, then millions of people around the world will respond from their heart, will support our efforts, and in the end, we will overcome. End quote. Cesar Chavez. Number 3, quote, is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? End quote. Fannie Lou Hamer. Number 4, quote, when white terrorists bomb a black church and kill 5 black children, that is an act of individual racism, widely deplored by most segments of the society. But when in that same city, Birmingham, Alabama, 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, and thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, and intellectually because of the conditions of poverty and discrimination in the black community, that is a function of institutional racism. When a black family moves into a home in a white neighborhood and is stoned, burned, or routed out, they are victims of an overt act of individual racism, which many people will condemn, at least in words. But it is institutional racism that keeps black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploitative slumlords, merchants, loan sharks, and discriminatory real estate agents. The society either pretends it does not know of this latter situation or is in fact incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. End quote. Stokely Carmichael. Number 5, last one. Quote, it is true that women have seldom been aggressive in demanding their rights and so have cooperated in their own enslavement. This was true of the black population for many years, but they submitted to oppression and even condoned it. But women are becoming aware, as blacks did, that they can have equal treatment if they will fight for it, and they are willing to organize. To do it, they have to dare the sanctions that society imposes on anyone who breaks with its traditions. This is hard, and especially hard for women, who are taught not to rebel from infancy, from the time they are first wrapped in pink blankets, the color of their caste. End quote. Shirley Chisholm. Again, feel free to look up more about the people that I've mentioned. There are many, many more eyewitnesses who were present during this period when America was great, who can help us to understand the full context that we need when we think about what is happening in our times today. If you have any, please email us at ClassofHC@gmail.com. We'd love to add those to the discussion. Thanks for listening. Have a great one.